Hello, my name is Sean Nickel, and to whom it may concern, I have chosen to research Virginia Woolf's Death of the Moth, located on page 1394 in the Broadview Introduction to Literature. My research question was, why does Woolf's depiction of such immense life and energy at the beginning of the story have such an enormous impact on the tone of the story when the moth dies? I'm going to begin by explaining to you the importance of my research question and how it is relevant to the way we interpret Death of the Moth. Death of the Moth stood out to me, and I chose to research it because of the emotional impact I felt after reading it. I was intrigued by the way Woolf uses detail and simplicity to paint a clear setting and tone before engaging in the plot. All stories are mapped out differently. Some give a brief illustration of surroundings and jump right into the plot, but in Death of the Moth, I believe that Virginia Woolf's style of writing is what creates the deep emotional connection to her story. Woolf begins her story on a rather positive note. In a world full of life, she recognizes very specific characteristics, such as the knot at the end of a twig or the plow pulled by a horse breaking new soil. She then goes on to notice a moth, so simple and helpless, bouncing against a window. Woolf shares her thoughts on the moth and how amazed she is with the complexity of life poured into this insignificant creature. Woolf goes on to study the moth and its simplicity when it begins to die. This is where the story takes a very dark turn, and the whole world seems to pause for a moment. The tone of the story becomes very much the opposite of what it was at the beginning. Woolf's portrayal of life and energy at the beginning of the story reinforces the ample U-turn that the tone takes when the moth begins to perish. It is important to recognize that the tone of a story and how it impacts the way we understand different aspects of it. Whether we know it or not, all stories have a tone. Only by reflecting on a reading afterwards is when we are able to inspect the highs and lows different paragraphs, sentences, and even a single word can have. For instance, on page 1396 in the Broadview Introduction to Literature, when Woolf says, "Then, looking up, my eye caught him. He was trying to resume his dancing." The tone of the story changes exactly on the word "trying." This immensely complex form of life, yet in such simple form, is no longer cluelessly bouncing off the window, but is now struggling to fly. Based on the title, we make the hypothesis that this is when the moth begins to die, though it is not a slow death. In fact, it is a prolonged struggle for life that this helpless insect does not understand, and all we can do is continue reading. The tone causes the story to become somewhat of a tragedy almost. Just like that, a single word has pointed the tone in a different direction. I stumbled across an article called Virginia Woolf, Neuroprogression and Bipolar Disorder. After reading the article that claims Virginia Woolf suffered from bipolar disorder, I began to make a connection. The layout and tone of Death of the Moth could be a reflection of an individual suffering from bipolar disorder. The story begins with wonder and curiosity of life and ends with stillness and death, just like the high highs and low lows experienced by individuals diagnosed with bipolar disorder. The seemingly positive introduction to Death of the Moth engages the reader with every detail Woolf pours into the story. The content becomes more interesting with each sentence as Woolf highlights new characteristics of life. By detailing the moth so well and highlighting it has just as much life in it as a person, it is given a personality. When the moth begins to die, the reader is overwhelmed with shock and confusion because they are so focused on the personality Woolf gives the moth. It is almost like watching a human die. In conclusion, I have determined that by using such simple descriptive characteristics in the beginning of the story and referring to the moth as he, Virginia Woolf creates a human-like personality for the moth, and that is why we are so disturbed by the slow death that comes to follow. Thank you for listening.